little bar is there, and sometimes it's not, and there's a little tab where you can pop it out. Is everybody like, yes, I recognize this from Blackboard before? Pretty much. Okay. When you click on learning modules, you'll see the syllabus is linked here, and you'll notice that you get this big table of dates and information. At the end of each class, it takes me a couple hours each afternoon, but usually I can do it that same day. I will upload the slides from what we actually covered in class that day. And so the introduction from Tuesday here is a clickable link where I'll take you to the slides. The other thing that will be on here is the homework assignments. And so I hand you homework assignment 1 right now. And if you click on its link, it will take you to this file where you can download it yourself and you can fill it out at your leisure. The first homework for this class, I'm asking you to look into 20 different ecologists. And I'm expecting like 2 sentences about each of these. One is, this person lived from this date to this date, to the best of my understanding. Like some of them are like Aristotle, like it's kind of fuzzy. Okay. And then the second sentence is, what did this person contribute to ecology? Okay, why is Daniel asking me about this particular person? Some of this information is in our textbook. You can look up some of these guys in the index and you will find information about them. The other thing I have linked is a Wikipedia page where many of these people are found and listed as important ecologists. And again, you can find the links to them. You can read their little Wikipedia article. You can write me 1 sentence about them. Okay. On the first exam, I'll have a matching section where 10 of these guys will be on there on one side, will be their names. On the other side of the matching will be why they're important to ecology. Okay, and you'll match them and you'll get 10 points. Okay. It's a homework assignment, which means that I'm going to look at it and I'm going to grade it and give it back to you well before that exam, so that you know you got it right and you have the thing that I'm going to be putting on the exam down for these ecologists. Okay. Yeah, City.
So you only need to write 1 sentence? Can you write more?
You can write more. Okay. I'm like, oh my God. To me, I'm like, there are 20 things on here and I have a week. Like that makes me like, oh, it's well up a little bit inside. Okay. That would like make me nervous. So a sentence that really encapsulates why they're important is all that I need. If you want to write 3 or 4 sentences so that you really have nailed it, do it. Okay. But definitely don't feel like you need to write an extensive truth stay on each of these. And some of them are a couple people together, Locke and Volterra, as well as the Grants, which are the last one. Peter and Rosemary are a group, are a husband-wife pair, and we'll talk a lot about Locke and Volterra later on in the class as it relates to predation. They're 2 different guys, but they came up with the same thing. Yeah.
Can we write on like a separate paper or do?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, don't feel like you got to fit it on this page. This is so you have the list. I fully expect that you'll take this and you'll type it up, or you'll write out another piece of paper. That's what you turn in. Okay. You can turn in a hard copy to me after class next Thursday. You can turn in a hard copy online. Okay, so if you click on the homework 1 due link, it will take you to the assignments portion of Blackboard where you can upload a file and drop it. If you are feeling in the mood and you want to like voice record this as you're doing each one, like do that. Give me a sound file. Like any type of file can go in here. You want to do a video blog about each one and have a little slide, like way awesome. But that's totally, that's in your wheelhouse. Okay. All right, so learning modules is really important. The assignments tab is the other one here that helps out a lot. It will take you to the homework assignments where you can download the file, which is exactly what I just gave you. And if you click on the top, it'll take you back to that submission site. Any questions? It's worth a fraction of your final grade. This is one of the ways in which you can do stuff other than just taking exams and coming to lab to get a good grade and be successful. Yeah.
I know you talked about this, but like, is the PDF for chapter 1 or 2 like?
I haven't uploaded it, but I certainly will. I can do that. I'll get that today. Okay. You feel good about Blackboard? All right, let's talk. Did I get it down? What? All right, today in class, I want us to talk about climate. It turns out that if we're going to talk about ecology, and it's the study of the interactions between organisms, interactions between organisms kind of goes around in the cycle. Whatever scale we want to talk about ecology on, it starts with an understanding of the abiotic environment in which those organisms find themselves. They're constantly evolving and adapting alongside each other. And so we're going to start by talking about these abiotic conditions because they set the stage for all these organism interactions that we're really excited about. Okay, so that's where we are today. Each class, I'm going to start with a learning objective slide, and hopefully it'll be the outline for you for your notes, however you want to take notes, that, you know, this is A, B, C, that we're going to talk about today. We're going to link our abiotic and biotic systems. We're going to talk a lot about climate and see how that influences the distribution of biomes of big ecosystems across the planet. And then at the same time, we're going to have these huge broad scale patterns that we're talking about today, but it's the little minutia that are actually really important for organisms, for individuals in their ecosystems. And so at the same time, we're going to be today really appreciative of heterogeneity, of the actual, you know, little changes and influences, because that's what individuals work with. Even though we're going to be talking today about these huge broad scale patterns that are on the biosphere scale. Okay. With the slides being up there for you guys after class, I find that, and I hope that the learning objective slide is your first kind of study guide. When you go back to study for an exam or at the end of the day after class, you can say, okay, can I make the linkage between biotic and abiotic systems, living and non-living things? How is heterogeneity important for organisms on a couple different scales? Okay. Sometimes there'll be lots of things here. Sometimes there's a few things. I usually try to talk while you guys can write these things down if you choose to do so at the time. If you miss one, just, you know, put an asterisk. There was another one, I need to write it down later because the slides are going to be on there. All right, cool. All right, so I just gave you a definition of ecology, but you can turn to your neighbor and see if you can define ecology similar to what we did on class on Tuesday. And then at the end of class, we talked about these temporal spatial scales. So like, what was that? Can you describe temporal spatial scales that you can look at in ecology? Okay, go. Okay. And if you want to be like one big group, that's fine. Like this is the whole class. There you go. If you want to be, this is it. If you want to be a big group, that's fine. If you want to pair off, if you want to think by yourself, that's okay too. But this, again, I'll start off each class almost always with a review question to highlight the important part, not all of them, but some of the important things from the last class. And again, if you missed the last class, then you're with us and you're ready to go. Okay, so what is ecology? And then tell me about a temporal and a spatial scale. All right. Give you a couple minutes.
Are we doing a big group or are we doing a small group?
Well, I missed it yesterday. You guys know what temporal and spatial aspects of ecology are?
Context clue-wise, I feel like small. Yeah.
Spatial is like density. Regional.
I see that.
I generally have no idea. I get really think of for the temporal spatial scale when too much. I don't remember that one.
Temporary.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, that sounds like something.
Temporal is time and then spatial is
Yeah, more time. Or, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds potential.
Okay, so what is ecology?
The study of organisms and the relationships with their environments.
Yeah, you got it. Okay, organisms and the environment and the interactions. That's the basis. Try to three things: organisms, the environment, and the interaction. We can be more specific. As I mentioned, we can talk about the distribution and abundance of organisms in the environment and interactions. But that's like the really formal one that you can't tell your grandma and have her understand at Thanksgiving. Okay, what about a spatial scale? What are some different spatial scales in which we can study ecology? Should we go back to the time one? Is that one easier? Yes. Okay. Let's start with the time one. What about temporal scales? To what?
To time. They only last a short amount of time for you to be able to take data.
Yeah. And then what's the opposite of that?
Much longer time.
Got it. Okay. Ecology happens instantaneously sometimes. An organism hunts and eats another one. And sometimes it happens on a really long time scale. Like it's going to take a year for predation impacts to really change the population. And so there are these different time scales in which we can ask the same questions, but we're going to design different experiments to assess those different time scales. Thinking about that, how would you, and we're going to see today, everything varies on time and space. So time and time again, we're going to say, okay, this is the interaction at different time scales, instantaneously, seasonally, decadally. And then we're going to say, this also varies by latitude. We're going to say it varies over geographic space. So what are some different spatial scales then that we can look at in ecology?
Biomes and ecosystems and communities.
Good, and those are the big spatial scales, okay? Those are big geographic regions that are gonna have the same biome or the same ecosystem. It starts to get smaller geographic regions when we talk about specific communities, okay? We can have desert in lots of different places and recognize that they're desert, but the desert in the southwestern United States is really different than the desert in the Gobi Desert, in places in Mongolia and China. And I'm not a geography major, so I apologize if I say things and you're like, that's the same place, or those not on that continent, okay? We'll work together to get the geography right. What would be an even smaller spatial scale than the community?
Be a body.
Yeah, like an individual organism and what's happening at their cellular level, okay? That cell level has a really different time and spatial scale than the organism, than the population, the community, the ecosystem, the biosphere. Okay. And so again, we're gonna see that everything, constantly we're gonna be like, okay, this is what predation is. This is how it varies on time and space. This is how it varies community to community. And that understanding of how we approach ecology is gonna give you the way to organize yourself as we move through the class, because that's how I've organized it. And that idea about the different possibilities there are out there for ecology to be operating on, small scale, big geographic scale, short time frame, long time frame, again, should help you generate questions that you might have when you encounter different situations. And even as you are reading a study, hopefully you'll start to say, well, what happens if we shifted spatial scale? What happens if you looked at a shorter time frame? What happens if you let this experiment run for longer? You might get different results and come to different conclusions. And so the scales are something that we can use as a tool for ecology, and then they interact all the time. You know, what happens at the cellular level creates the individual. That's a member of that population. That's a member of the community. And so in our experiments, we're going to try to slice them very finely and separate them so we can ask reasonable questions and get reasonable answers. But there's always going to be this factor of what happens if we change time and space in our ecological context. Okay, so feel good. Glad we're on the same page. Maybe. All right. So, The next question comes, and I've mentioned this a little bit already, and this is a question that's at the end of chapter 1 in our textbook. It's like question 3 at the end of chapter 1, and it says, "Why include the abiotic environment in ecology?"
Because they interact with biotic.
Right. Okay, because it creates the environment, it creates the conditions that biotic, the living portion, needs. Okay, why else? Why else is the abiotic stuff important?
So, you said higher?
The abiotic, so it's important because the organisms are dependent upon that abiotic environment. You can think of it as kind of like a, I'm going to couch it in terms of resources. Is that what you're thinking, Cindy? Or, like the environment provides us with nitrogen and phosphorus.
Yes.
Okay. What else?
Don't abiotic factors affect biotic factors and then vice versa?
Yeah, they interact with each other all the time. And so you may be able to say, okay, this is the cause of this, but then it also is going to come back. And what the biology does is going to affect that abiotic environment, which will affect biology going on. And so again, it's like this cycle or this wheel, okay, where you can have environment affecting organisms. Organisms in turn will affect and change the environment, which means that we're going to have another organismal effect here. Might go back to the first place or it might spin off in another direction.
It's just like the sun, dirt, like everything that's going to affect plant growth or
Yes.
photosynthesis or whatever.
Right, or the plants that are there are going to affect the sunlight and the nutrients that are in the soil that are available for themselves and others. And so again, I'm interested in ecology because I like animals, very base level, and I want to interact with animals. I want to know how animals work and function physiologically as well as in ecological context. And my goal, my first format about an experiment is to work with animals. And so I'm going to oftentimes leave out the abiotic environment, but we can't separate them. And in ecology is the place where we really, really try to allow those interactions to dominate. And we want to not separate organisms from their environment because we recognize that there's this interplay. And so again, we're going to spend the first couple of weeks of class here talking about the abiotic environment, water, and then soil, essentially land environment. And we're going to start today by talking about climate because that's what creates the water and the soil conditions for the organisms. We tend to want to discard it because we're so interested in the organisms, but we can't. And what varies on time and space very often is the abiotic environment that sets up these different conditions for organisms to interact. Okay, all right, so this is what I have just said in little flowcharty form. The physical environment determines and influences what organisms and communities we're going to find where. So again, our base question is about the distribution and abundance of organisms. They're there in that abundance because of the resources and conditions that are provided for them. Okay, so resources and conditions in the abiotic environment, the physical conditions, predict first and foremost what plants will be there, what autotrophs we can find, and we're going to call them again like the base of our food web or our trophic pyramid. Because certain autotrophs are there, certain types of heterotrophs, our animals are going to be there. If you don't have a certain type of autotroph, you will start to exclude or incorporate different types of heterotroph, different types of consumers. And again, to say animal here is a disservice to heterotrophic bacteria and fungi, which we know are out there. Even some types of heterotrophic plants that can do both, but for purposes of the nice little flow chart, we talk about animals. Yes.
Is it kind of, I heard like down south, like on the coast, they have kind of round up like owls and hawks to scare off seagulls.
Oh, yeah.
Seagulls are encountering
Yes.
the beaches and
Oh,
stuff
yeah.
down there, so they
Yeah.
brought predatory birds
Mhm.
scared away.
Yes.
For
Yes.
certain hours of the day.
Yeah. And the reason that those owls and hawks are there is because of the resources, and the temperature range is just right for those types of species to be there. And again, you see the interplay. Once you have certain types of animals, you'll start to feed back into the types of plants that are there. Once you have certain types of animals, they're going to alter the nutrient condition of that environment, either to perpetuate themselves, or we'll see what we're going to call community succession and changes over time. Sweet. When we think about resources and conditions, today I want us to consider that the base condition and the base types of resources that are present for organisms and in an environment is based on climate. And climate is made up of two basic factors, and we're going to add a third one in just a second. But pretty much climate is temperature and precipitation. And these two things together, variations over time and space, in temperature and precipitation, which fall under the umbrella of climate, determine what types of plants we have, what type of biome. And again, in terrestrial communities, we define biome or ecosystem by the dominant type of plant. So your temperature and precipitation determines if you have a forest, a desert, a grassland. Okay. The combination of the two can refine the subtype of any particular type of environment. So in general, the type of precipitation determines forest, desert, grassland. When we layer on temperature to that precipitation regime, remember precipitation is like rainfall, snowfall. Hail doesn't usually play a big role, but it's there. When you layer on temperature to that, then in terms of the forest ecosystem, you get a deciduous temperate forest, or you get a cold coniferous taiga, tundra-like ecosystem. Well, tundra is more grassland than the taiga. Okay. So precipitation gives us the type of plants that can grow there. We layer on temperature, we get a very particular type of plant that can be there. That type of plant then determines what types of animals are present. And so in our forest ecosystem, depending on temperature, we'll have deciduous trees that lose their leaves, or we'll have conifers, and there are different types of herbivores that do better with deciduous versus coniferous trees, okay? Deer do great with these types of acorn nut producing, seed producing, flowering tree type ecosystems that we find in the temperate deciduous forest. It turns out moose and caribou do a lot better in the conifer or taiga tundra type ecosystem where it's cold. And they have different, you can think the moose and the deer are similar four-legged ungulate herbivores, then they have different adaptations to their precipitation and temperature regime in which they find themselves. So they interact. And again, that interaction is what creates the type of community that we're interested in and generates cool questions for us. So at the base of all of this ecology, what I'm building up to is that climate, okay, provides the basic abiotic factors, temperature and precipitation, which determine where plants grow and which plant is there, gives you the animals, the consumer, the food web that you're going to find in that particular location. This particular figure is showing you in different colors all the different biomes and big ecosystem scale divisions that we tend to place across the globe. The deserts are, and of course, in the kind of brown sandy colors. The forests are in the green colors. And again, we'll talk about what makes this biome, that biome, and other ones as we move through the semester. But there's a lot of variation, okay, over space. Okay? And as we'll talk about, these can vary over time as well. What's really interesting, though, is that we find similar patterns of forest and forest, of deserts in certain places, kind of mirrored around the equator on the globe, north and south. And again, we're going to be super focused today in terms of thinking about climate and temperature and precipitation in terms of land ecosystems, because that's what we're most familiar with, and that's what makes the nice little story today. But we're going to talk about how this affects aquatic ecosystems on Monday, too, and because that's also happening at the same time. So don't freak out if you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know where to find a desert or not. We're going to talk about that. But notice that we have these patterns that start to emerge as a result of climate. And that patterning is really interesting and generates really cool questions. And we start to see again that organisms in similar ecosystems on totally different continents have similar adaptations, even though they might have different specific evolutionary histories. And then we can start to ask, why does a particular region have a particular climate? Since that seems so important to the ecology of that region, why do we get different climates in different places on the globe? Okay, and that's what I'm going to tell you today. Okay. All right, so climate. If we want to define climate, we think of it as the average over decades or longer over a big geographic region in temperature, precipitation, and wind patterns. And we're going to see that temperature is directly linked to the wind pattern, and that precipitation follows directly from that temperature wind pattern profile. And so again, when we talk about climate, we talk about rainfall, we talk about average temperatures and minimum maximum ranges of temperatures. We talk about what direction the wind usually blows from, but they're all linked together. Okay, and again, what's happening at your local level is a factor of your large region climate. This also means that when we talk about climate change, then we have to be talking about variations in these factors over really long time scales. Okay? So the fact that we had a wet summer is not necessarily climate change, that's the weather we had this year. If we have wet summer, wet summer, wet summer, wet summer for 10 years, in the previous years it was very different, that's climate change. That's change in these weather patterns on the decadal time scale. And it has to be over a big geographic region. It can't just be that it rained in Cincinnati for 10 years in a row on January or on July 1st, okay? It has to be that the whole state of Indiana and Pennsylvania was wetter for the whole month of July for 10 years to be climate change. Okay? You have to have that big geographic component. Otherwise, we're talking about weather, which varies a lot, okay? And weather is really important to individual populations and individuals, but it's climate that determines kind of why those individuals are there to begin with. Okay, it's really cool. We can actually predict climate a season to a year in advance. That Farmer's Almanac that used to be published and is still published by the USA. And before that, it was done by a bunch of really interesting scientific people in the early days. They're talking about climate. When they say, hey, you should plant corn this year and you should wait to plant this year until after May 15th, they're working off climate data, okay, in order to make those predictions. And we still do that largely for the purpose of agriculture. When we're talking about predicting this activity of hurricanes in a particular hurricane season, we're working off climatological data to give us a prediction about weather. Lots of times that data and information comes from really interesting places about historical records about climate. Some of it comes sometimes from digging up sediments at the bottoms of lakes and the oceans and looking at different species of phytoplankton and how they've changed over time. Here we can see that there's snowpack up in the Rocky Mountains, and each kind of layer in this snow profile is a different year's snow. Okay? And that gives us a record for a decade or more, and in some cases, centuries, of what precipitation is like in that region. And based upon precipitation patterns, sometimes we can infer temperature changes. And so these types of climatological records then are really interesting from an ecological perspective. Does anybody know in this particular snowpack what might have caused all this dirt to accumulate?
It could have been a fire, it could have been ash.
Yeah, it's ash that was laid down. So in this case, this is most likely ash that was laid down when Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980. And again, you can see then worldwide events that might influence climate. Okay, things like a lot of ash in the atmosphere affects how much incoming solar radiation the Earth will receive. It reflects a bunch off in a way. And it will affect then temperature and precipitation regimes for at least usually the year to a couple forward, depending upon the magnitude of those types of events. It's pretty cool. This is one area where you can go into ecology, you can go into paleoecology by looking at these types of climatological records, thinking about the ecological conditions that organisms would have been adapting to and subjected to in the past. You could do with tree rings. I mentioned the phytoplankton records. Okay. What makes the climate? In any given location, solar radiation, the amount of incoming solar radiation for the sun, drives climate, both temperature and precipitation. Okay, so this is a map that's showing you the net radiation, the stuff that's actually absorbed by the surface of the Earth in kind of watts per meter squared. And the red colors are more intense solar radiation that's being absorbed, and it kind of goes to green at the poles here, is this. So what portion of the globe receives the most solar radiation? The equator, okay? We all get that. And then what is the kind of change as we move towards the poles in solar radiation? It gets less, yeah, okay? We get this information using rocket science today, but the interpretation and the data itself is not necessarily rocket science, okay? And definitely, again, like, we're starting out at the base, so we're all in the same place, so we can go kind of more fun things. Okay, so incoming solar radiation drives climate, and we recognize that solar radiation then varies depending upon where we are in the globe, and it varies latitudinally, okay? More at the equator, less at the poles. Okay, so it varies by latitude, and the equators receive more. Why?
Shape of the Earth
Right, the shape of the Earth
and the determination of the sun.
and where the sun is at, okay?
Above it.
Yeah, if it was right onto the poles would receive more. That's not how our Earth is oriented in relationship to the sun, right? Okay, we're like side on. Okay. What about the shape of the Earth? What is the shape of the Earth? Say that. What is the shape of the Earth? It's a sphere or a globe, okay? It's round. And that means that it's wider at some points that are closer to the sun, and farther away, it's narrower. And it turns out that is the key factor for how much solar radiation a given spot on the Earth receives. Okay, the fact that we're round means that different places are going to receive different amounts of solar radiation, and that then has these climatological consequences. Okay, again, not totally rocket science, but like you get it. You learned it in 3rd grade Earth science for a reason, that the Earth is round. This is why. Okay, so it works like this. Solar radiation varies by latitude because the Earth is a sphere. And it turns out that the radiation coming in from the sun, the light, and all the different wavelength components of light, go a shorter distance, and they're hit a smaller relative area when they hit the equator, which means that that given place on the equator is going to receive more radiation than the same little geographic spot at the pole or higher latitude, where the radiation has to travel farther, so more of it gets lost on its journey through space, and it's spread out over a larger area. So each unit of space on the Earth, each place on space, gets less. And so then we get that variation in solar radiation. It's lower at the poles, and there's this gradient to the most that's received at the equator, because the Earth is round. Christopher Columbus was onto something, and actually, he wasn't the first. Yeah. Right. You'll also notice that I'm starting to use figures from our textbook, and you'll see that figure is associated with the figure, so you can write down the figure number if you want to. You don't have to try to recreate this drawing in your notes. That's not my intention. The figures in our textbook are pretty good, and they demonstrate our base principles, and definitely the data figures we're going to have a lot of fun with as we move through the textbook, because our textbook does a really good job of bringing in kind of basic research and putting the data right there for us then to interpret it. Okay. All right, feel good? All right. Because we have different amounts of radiation, the immediate impact of different spots receiving different amounts of radiation is that there are different amounts of heating that take place. And this means that because radiation varies over the surface of the Earth, temperature varies. Okay, we get different amounts of solar radiation, The first impact of that is that different places on Earth are going to be different temperatures. And we see then, and this is a map of mean annual surface temperature. So instead of radiation, now we're mapping surface temperature, average over the course of a year. And we see that those temperature variations match those radiation variations. Okay. It is warmer on average around the equator, and it gradiates out into cooler average temperatures as we get towards the poles. Okay. Feel good? Again, it's like, why is it when I go to Florida, it's on average warmer than it is here in Ohio, and it's warmer here in Ohio than it is in Minnesota? Because Minnesota's getting less solar radiation and heating up less than Florida is. In Ohio's. All right. Hopefully, you're also starting to recognize that some of these patterns in temperature and radiation are starting to match the patterns that we saw in biome distribution. And that's because temperature is one of the things that affects where organisms can be. Every organism has its own minimum and maximum temperature. And it's going to live on the place that matches that temperature range. Okay, cool. All right. So that's the that's the spatial variation. That's the space variation in temperature. Why now does temperature vary over time, particularly over the course of the seasons? Yes. Because we rotate, okay? We're not always oriented the same towards the sun. So our amount of solar radiation any one place receives is going to vary not only on where it is on the globe, but where we are in relation to the sun, what time it is. And again, it's that time and space variation that gives us climate, that gives us these abiotic factors. Okay, so we know that as we go around the sun, the amount of solar radiation we receive varies, and we get winter when we get less radiation, right? It's summer when we get more radiation. But if the Earth is just going around the sun, twirling as it goes, and we'll talk about the twirl here in a second, the spin, then it should be the same. Like if we were just straight onto the sun, right? A spot would get the same all the time. Why is that not true?
Is it an oval? Circle?
Part of it's that we have this oval orbit, and it's a perfect circle, and that definitely then means that we have some variation. And the amazing thing is that that ellipse is not the same each year, and it moves on this 450,000 year cycle, which is why our climate varies on a 450,000 year cycle. It's more than we need to talk about in class. So not only that, yes, sometimes we'll be farther away, sometimes we'll be closer. That does influence winter, but still, it will kind of be the same on the north and the south. Why is it different northern to southern hemisphere?
The Earth is tilted slightly.
Okay, so not only are we orbiting the sun in an ellipse, but the Earth is tilted on its axis. This means that sometimes when we're going around the sun, we're closer to it, and sometimes as we're moving around the sun, we get farther away. Okay, and when we're farther away in the ellipse and on the tilt, we get less solar radiation. It's winter. When we're closer, it's and that gives us the time variation then that we see in temperature at every location. Okay, did you get it? Are you totally confused about my apples? Okay, all right. So the Earth's axis tilts, and the Earth varies in its rotation and orientation to the sun because of this tilt and because we're in an orbit around the sun. And this means that our radiation varies seasonally. Because radiation varies seasonally, temperatures vary seasonally. And again, when it's summer and we're getting the most incoming solar radiation, it's warmer, it's summertime. When we're kind of more straight on, then it's our equinoxes, spring and fall. When we're kind of tilted furthest away up here, we're getting less solar radiation, and it's winter. Okay, all this data, all these words down here are in reference to the northern hemisphere. Okay. And by and large, we're going to talk about organisms that are in the northern hemisphere because one, that's where we have the most data to talk about organisms and interactions. Two, that's where the people who wrote your textbook are based. And so they wrote it from the northern hemisphere perspective. But recognize that on a time scale, this seasonal information and cycles are switched. in the southern hemisphere, okay? And then of course, when the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun and it's summer, the southern hemisphere is tilted away and it's winter. The opposite happens. Yeah.
Is that why, us Americans, we love to vacation in the winter and we like to go to like those tropical areas?
Exactly, yes.
Because any other time there it's rainy.
Right. And again, we're going to talk about the precipitation next. But we're going to see that given any time of the year, the equator is going to be getting more solar radiation and the tilt affects these areas less. So it's warmer there on average in general. And we often like to go, from Minnesota down to places, in Mexico or just across the equator into South America because it's winter then, or summer then when it's winter where they are. Right? That works. Should work great for the tourism industry. Somebody's always going somewhere, which is why they do that. Yeah. The other super cool thing is that our Earth is tilted right now at 23.5 degrees relative to the sun's orientation. That tilt wobbles too, and that will affect temperature and precipitation regimes. And again, it has this super long 100,000 year time scale to kind of move between 21.5 and 24.5 degree tilt. And we know it does that from those climatological records that are stored in glaciers and sediments and tree boulders. Okay, all right, so because temperature varies seasonally and kind of really on this spatial scale from the equator to the poles, why does it matter that temperature varies? What are in the abiotic environment? What would temperature affect? Precipitation, because that's what we're talking about today. It's temperature and precipitation. Okay, the questions are kind of leading to help you. Sometimes they'll be out of the blue. Sometimes they're just arguing with me. What else? So precipitation is definitely one of these things. Because temperature varies, precipitation varies. What else will vary or move because of unequal heating or temperature variations?
Biotic.
So what again?
The biotic things.
So definitely physical, like abiotic stuff. So water moves. What else moves?
Plant growth. That's still okay.
What was your question? What's affected by latitude?
Yeah, or temperature variations. Because temperature varies latitudinally. What was that?
Wind pattern?
Wind patterns. Okay? Precipitation and wind, air and water move because of unequal heating, because of unequal temperatures in different locations. And that creates climate. That creates where plants are going to grow because they have different temperature and precipitation. The precipitation and the wind that brings it is a direct result of the temperature variations. Cool. Okay, so latitudinal plus seasonal radiation variances create temperature, wind, and precipitation patterns. Okay. Because radiation varies over time and space, we get temperature variations, we get wind blowing, we get precipitation happening into greater and lesser extents in different locations. And that gives us then the different plant biomes. We're going to see that wind has a huge effect on aquatic environments. And because wind is moving due to unequal solar heating, we can tie it back to the same base principles of climate. How many of you knew this before class today? Yeah, and you knew it, right? Again, you're seeing this, you're like, oh yeah, I know that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's why we have to talk about it, and maybe we're talking about it in a little more complex or different way than you thought about it before. Definitely perhaps in a different context. This is base earth science and meteorology. It's what you see every day on the Weather Channel. But it's really interesting to think that we attribute so much of life on Earth to the sun because of photosynthesis. here's life on Earth because of the sun in a different kind of aspect. Okay, without that incoming solar radiation, we wouldn't have temperature variations to give us different opportunities for organisms. We wouldn't have wind patterns, we wouldn't have precipitation patterns. Okay, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what these wind and precipitation patterns look like and how they're created again by these different temperature and radiation regimes that we see across the globe. And by and large, we're going to focus on the latitudinal gradient and changes in wind and precipitation. And we're going to throw in the seasonal stuff kind of every once in a while just to be like, and yet it varies. Okay. Even the pattern that we can talk about in the drawings. Okay. All right, cool. All right. So in an idealized world, okay, this is an idealized Earth. We're going to talk about what actually happens in 1 second. We have unequal heating of the Earth's surface, and with that, we're going to warm the atmosphere at the equator more. Okay, remember, warm air is less dense, right? And one thing that happens with warmer temperature is the molecules spread out, they get less dense. So warm air is going to rise at the equator because it's less dense. And cold air then is going to blow in over the surface of the Earth to replace that. It's not like there's a vacuum at the equator where all the air is risen and there's nothing there. Okay, that rising air is replaced by cooler air that flows in from higher latitudes. Okay, that creates wind at those low latitudes flowing in towards the equator. Okay, that warm air then moves up into the atmosphere where it gets cold, because it's not next to the hot surface of the Earth anymore. And so that air, as it rises up into the atmosphere, will sink back down as it cools, okay? And the sinking action of that warm air replaces the incoming cold air that's coming down to the equator, okay? This is wind, all right? Moving air is wind. It's due to unequal heating of the Earth's surface, giving us different density air molecules. And the interplay of the heating and cooling of that air and the movement and exchange in density is wind, okay? Again, like you knew this. Let's put it on the globe now, okay? So we have this density gradient that happens because they have light warm air that rises at the equator. As it cools, it gets heavier and it falls back down and becomes the cold air that goes back towards the equator. As the wind and the air is flowing over the surface of the Earth, it's changing temperature, okay? It's picking up heat as it's coming towards the equator and getting warmer. It's losing heat as it's flowing. So remember, density is the amount of a substance per unit volume. Here and in water, we're going to see it plays a big role in relationship to temperature. The warmer something is, the less dense it is, the higher up it's going to be. The cooler it is, the more dense something is, the deeper down, closer to the Earth's surface it will be. We'll talk about how water is not most dense at 0, it's at 4 degrees Celsius. We'll get there. Okay, this is an idealized world. You may already be familiar that there's not just one big loop of warm, cold air in the northern and the southern hemispheres. Okay, there's actually several bands of wind, and they're created by the rotation of the Earth. Okay, again, if the Earth was just sitting there spinning, this would be what happened, but it's tilted and its orbit is turning on its own axis each day. And that then gives us the actual wind patterns, precipitation patterns. Okay, so the Earth rotates not only as it's moving around the sun and it's tilted and going on this yearly cycle, but the Earth rotates every day. Okay, it rotates on its own axis. And this has consequences for day-night temperatures. But when we talk about climate, we're talking about long time scales, and so it's really the average over day and night that we talk about in terms of climatological temperatures. But that rotation of the Earth has really big consequences for stuff that's not stuck to the surface of the Earth, wind and water. Okay. And so that as the Earth is rotating, the surface all goes at the same speed. But because the air and the water aren't attached to the surface of the Earth, they don't move at the same speed, and they can be deflected and turned in really interesting ways by that rotation of the Earth. And this rotation of wind and water that's going to seem counterintuitive to how the Earth is spinning and moving is called the Coriolis Effect. And it has big consequences for global wind patterns and global ocean circulation. And the ocean circulation part is important because the wind and ocean circulation move temperature and precipitation around the globe that are that next scale, finer scale of climate. Okay, the way that the Coriolis effect works is that the Earth is spinning on its daily axis, and the point that's at the pole has to come back to the same place in time as the same point on the equator. But a point that's on the equator has to go farther in the same time period of the day than a point that's up at the pole. So stuff at the equator is moving faster relatively on a daily basis than stuff that's at the pole. Okay. For us on land that are stuck on the Earth, no big deal. Okay. For the water in your toilet bowl, no big deal. Okay. But for water molecules in the ocean, for wind moving across the surface of the Earth, that difference in velocity, pole to equator, is a big deal. Okay. It means that if you are coming, let's see, the first one here I had, if you're going from greater circumference to lower circumference, the equator to the poles, when you move, okay, you're going to be going faster. I should do it on this side. You're going to be going faster than kind of the Earth is rotating out from under you. Okay? And you're going to end, if you go in a straight line, the Earth is going to rotate away from where you're headed. And so you get burned. Okay. This is why when you're taking a long kind of intercontinental airplane flight, they like go way north and then they come back down. Because if they flew in a straight line, the Coriolis effect would turn the Earth away from where you were trying to get to. It's why when we send intercontinental ballistic missiles, they have this weird trajectory to swing out and come back around and hit places in Russia than just flying straight there. Okay. So it's really an interesting physics problem that ends up having ecological consequences in this kind of context. Okay, the way that it plays out is that if you're going from greater circumference, the equator, to the poles, stuff gets deflected into the direction of the spin of the Earth as it's rotating, okay? If you're going from lower circumference of the Earth from the pole to the equators, you get deflected in the opposite direction of the spin of the Earth, okay? The easiest way to remember the Coriolis effect is that winds and water in the northern hemisphere circulate clockwise. Okay. They get deflected this direction as they're going around, and then they get deflected in the opposite direction as they come back to the equator. And the wind and the ocean currents are going to move in a clockwise direction in the northern hemisphere. They're going to circulate like this. It's the opposite in the southern hemisphere. Things move counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. They go down and then they go back around. Okay. Clockwise in the northern hemisphere, counterclockwise in the southern. Are you with me? A little bit. I would say that the Coriolis effect is one of the most difficult concepts in class. Like, we have to start on the second day of class. But hopefully you recognize that as we build up to the different kind of variations that we have in the way that our Earth moves, there are physical consequences for wind and water. Clockwise in the northern hemisphere, counterclockwise in the south. Okay. The Coriolis effect, the rotation of the Earth on its own axis, in terms of wind patterns, then it can be pretty dramatic. Instead of having just that one big loop that we have, we end up having 3 bands of dominant wind patterns, both in the northern hemisphere as well as in the southern hemisphere. Okay. And so this is what it actually looks like. Okay. If we layer on unequal heating and radiation plus the rotation of the Earth on its axis, plus the fact that we're a sphere, we get our actual global wind patterns. And we see that at the equator, we have warm air that's rising because it's less dense, and it actually blows this way in the northern hemisphere towards the east. It's a kind of a westerly pattern, what we would call a Hadley cell. Then it cools and sinks back down at about 30 degrees north latitude. And there's a similar cell from the equator to 30 degrees south latitude in the southern hemisphere. What's kind of cool about these guys is that the returning wind pattern of the air coming back down and the cold air from 30 degrees north and south flowing towards the equator drags everything towards the equator, and you get this divergence. So, and this is why once you get into this particular region of the world's oceans, you can take the wind and the water patterns directly to these tropical regions where you find cool things that you might discover, cool people with bunches to trade. And so this region of the world is warm, it's sunny, it gets lots of rain, and it's easy to get to, which is why a lot of civilization is based from the equator in really broad historical human context. Okay. All right. Between 30 degrees north and south latitude and 60 degrees north and south latitude, we have what are known as the Feral cells. Okay, and this is named again after the meteorologist who discovered these guys, both Hadley and then Feral. And then we have a different kind of situation here where we have divergence of wind patterns. You notice that they're moving away from 30 degrees north and south latitude. And it's this then would drags you away from these particular regions, and it makes it easy to get from North America to Europe following the wind patterns, but you got to go south in latitude to be able to make the return trip. Okay. The other thing that you might notice, there's a little polar cell at each of the poles that again goes in the opposite direction. Where some of these cells meet, where you have these convergence zones, there's actually not a lot of winds. So here, here, and up at that very particular band at the poles, there's actually not a lot of wind, and you can get stuck in what's known as the doldrums. And those can be places where you have to wait kind of for a storm to be able to push you latitudinally back into one of these big wind systems or circulation gyres to get you going where you want to in the ocean. And this is, again, why sometimes in early nautical navigation, we talk about getting in the right pattern, getting in the right current, and being afraid of places like the doldrums where you can get stuck of the dominant wind pattern not moving anywhere. We have motors, and this stuff plays a lot less of an influence on where we're going, but it still has a ton to do with precipitation. Okay, in places where you have warm air rising and then cooling, you're going to have precipitation. But where you have cold air coming back down or warm air descending that's already rained out all of its precipitation, you're going to get a desert because all the moisture is gone from the air as it's returning to the earth. Okay. And again, you can see we have these mirroring bands of different temperature-driven wind patterns north and south, and that gives us bands of tropical rainforest where it's raining, followed by bands of desert that are mirrored north and south on the continents. And it's all because we're a globe rotating around the sun that's tilted on its axis and spinning on that axis too. Okay, just kind of cool. Are you with me? I'm not going to ask you to tell me which is the Feral cell and the Hadley cell, like, because you're going to look in your book when you want to know that information, and that's what you should do. Okay. But you should know that there are these different latitudinal bands of wind, and that it has consequences for ocean circulation first and foremost, and then for temperature and precipitation driven latitudinal changes. Okay, so as the wind is moving, guess what? It drags the water with it. Okay, and just as the wind is moving due to the Coriolis effect in certain directions, the water is also turning due to the Coriolis effect underneath that friction-induced wind movement. And so because the Earth is spinning, because we have unequal heating, because we have wind and different temperatures of the water, we get circulation to the world's oceans as well as the world's atmosphere. Okay. And this is the broad scale picture of ocean circulation. The red arrows are warm currents that by and large are moving either around the equator or they're moving water from the equator where it's been warmed up to colder latitude. And the reason this water is being pushed in this direction is because the wind is pushing it that way. And the reason the wind is flowing in that direction is because the Earth is a globe, we have unequal heating, because we have latitudinal temperature differences, and because we're rotating on our axis for the Coriolis effect. Okay, here's the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of North America. This is the nice warm Gulf Stream. that we're all familiar with from vacation time. Okay. Once this warm water gets to higher latitudes, just like the air cools down, so does the water. And it gets more dense and it sinks down a little bit and it flows back towards the equator to replace the water that was swept away by the winds and the Gulf current in the first place. You'll notice that there is a similar system working counterclockwise in the southern Atlantic Ocean. Off the coast of California, it's not warm, it's cold. Why is it cold?
Cold wind is coming down and push cold water down.
Yeah,
Directing it the other way.
exactly. The dominant wind pattern here is dragging cold water from the north down along the coast of the United States. You know, if you go swimming off the coast of California, it's really different in temperature than off the coast of Georgia, which is at the same latitude. Okay. The warm current that's bringing warm water across the Pacific Ocean is actually flowing along the equator. It's going off the coast of Japan. Japan has a really pretty mild climate at big ranges, so it's really nice there. That's the Coriolis current. That's really important for Pacific Ocean. Like sea life, there are a bunch of coral reefs all along that portion of the Pacific Ocean, actually, that are really unique and different from the classic warm coral reef that we see in the southern portion of the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Australia. Yeah.
Is the one that's up there by California, is that like the trash, like little tornado thing that you can see from space?
Totally. Okay, so this water and these currents are flowing around the edges of the ocean basin because we have winds that are moving water and then it hits land and it has to go somewhere else. Okay. In the middle of each of these, what we call gyres, is a relatively calm area of water, and not necessarily wind, but of water. And it's in those calm areas that we're starting to recognize that trash accumulates because it's not being moved by the wind and the ocean currents around. It's like it's ending up in a landfill, essentially, in the surface waters. And it's not just the surface waters. So we talk about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's in the middle of this where it's calm. If you go to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, you hit the Sargasso Sea, which is a relatively calm area that's typified by Sargasso seaweed that accumulates in these big mats because it's relatively calm and stable. That's not broken up by wind and wave action in that location. That's a little ecosystem. Again, we can explain these different biomes, these ecological problems based upon climate and variations in differences of incoming solar radiation at its base. Okay, cool. All right, so I kind of answered this question already. Why are the coastal waters of the southeastern United States warmer than the coastal waters of the southwestern United States? They have different ocean currents that are flowing through them. So again, you might expect that on the coast, at the same latitude, you would have similar temperatures. But because the ocean is different at these two locations, different in terms of their coastal temperatures. That's the heterogeneity part of class today. All right, local variations are actually important to the types of biomes that you're gonna get. Okay, and again, inland where you're not influenced by the ocean, it is the same at a latitude. When you're on the coast, you can be influenced by what the water's doing. Okay, all right, so winds and ocean currents, first and foremost, they distribute heat around the globe. We know that the poles would be much colder than they are if it wasn't for this flow of heat due to warmer and ocean currents taking heat from the equator and pushing it towards the poles. Likewise, the equator would be a lot warmer if it didn't have this injection of cold air and cold water flowing back down from the poles. It is this movement and this rotation that makes life possible in so many different places on Earth rather than just at the equator. All right. We're looking at mean sea surface temperature here, and we can see again the Gulf Stream as it is flowing across the Atlantic Ocean over to Europe. Okay. You can grow grapes in France because of the Gulf Stream bringing in warm water to bathe the peninsula and the coastline there. Look at Great Britain and the temperature around Great Britain compared toward the same temperature of the ocean off the coast of Canada in Labrador and Newfoundland. Okay, that's a big difference of like 10 degrees Celsius between running around in your shorts and wearing your parka all the time. Okay, that's because of unequal heating and the Coriolis effect moving ocean currents and with it temperature around the globe. It also means that coastlines tend to have a pretty moderate temperature because a ton of the temperature is absorbed by the water, so it doesn't heat up as much. Then the water acts like a heat reservoir to warm coastlines in the wintertime when it gets cold. Usually inland places have a much bigger range of temperatures they experience than what happens on the coast, where the ocean acts both as a heat sink and then as a reservoir of heat to give off. Okay. All right, the kind of last thing to consider here today is that these currents, as they're moving temperature, they move moisture too. Okay. And so this has to do with that warm air rising, and then as it cools, it cannot hold as much moisture, and so it rains. And so where that warm air is rising and cooling in the atmosphere, it's going to rain a lot. But where that cool air is coming down, there's not a lot of rain that's going to be happening. And so because of that, we get a bunch of precipitation around the equator. So red numbers here indicate highest amount of precipitation, kind of on an annual average or annual accumulation at different locations. And the blue numbers indicate less precipitation. Okay. So warm air at the equator can hold a lot of moisture. As it rises, it releases that precipitation and it rains a lot. Okay. It happens that that kind of region there's not a lot of landmass here in the kind of western hemisphere, so you don't see it to the same extent. Where that cold air comes back down, you get deserts. Okay, north and south. Okay. The same thing is happening. You have warm air rising at about 60 degrees north and south latitude, and then the cold air coming back down. So you can get another band of a lot of precipitation. Yeah, my color's backwards. I wonder how like this makes no sense. Okay, blue color is lots of precipitation. These are the deserts. Okay. Ooh, yeah. This is like the 150th slide I've talked about so far. Okay, lots of precipitation at the equator, less so as you get in that cooling air, which is right here for the deserts. Okay, and again, you can see north and south it's mirrored. Okay. But you get lots of precipitation up here. We have warm air that's rising and it's going to come down to the cool south to meet it at 30 degrees. Cool, and that's it. The temperature and the precipitation variations give us these different biomes that we recognize based upon the plants that the temperature and precipitation supports. Okay, it varies seasonally too, okay, and because we're tilted to and from the surface, our orientation to the sun, and not only do we get these latitudinal variations in precipitation, you get a bunch of precipitation here as you're rising up from the equator. You get a bunch of precipitation right about 60 degrees north and south latitude, because again, you have this warm air mass that's rising and then it's going to sink back down. Where these two sinkings happen, you get that desert band of lower precipitation. Because our tilt in relationship to the sun varies, we get seasonal patterns of precipitation. And so when we get lots of radiation, we warm up, it's wetter. When we're turned away, we tend to get less warming, less evaporation, less moisture held in the air. It's going to be relatively drier. And that wet, dry season then becomes really important in the tropics, where that's the only variation that happens. It's pretty hot and warm all year. Because they're tilted further closer to the sun, then they're going to get more or less evaporation and precipitation. That gives you that seasonal monsoon cycle that's so prevalent in our tropical biomes. And that's what the next slide shows. That as you swing towards the sun in the summertime at the equator, you get lots of rain. It's the rainy season. As you move away from it in the wintertime, there's less evaporation and precipitation. It's going to be the dry season. Cool. Is everybody with me? Do you think this is cool?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. again, it's like this really basic information, but when you put it all together, you're like, dang, maybe I get it a little bit. And again, this is the broad scale pattern, and we aren't going to encounter it other than to say we're in a forest. And you know it's a forest because it rains and it has a temperature regime. It rains and it has a temperature regime because of this stuff we talk about today. But for the rest of the semester, we're going to be like, we're in a forest, we're in a desert. But you can start to make assumptions then about the factors that are influencing that ecosystem because you know something about it. Okay, so this again, we did this part today. I'm going to ask you here at the end of class, based upon what you know about biomes, to label, excuse me, my turn, to label for me this graph. So we have temperature on the vertical y-axis going from cold to warm. And we have precipitation over an annual cycle going from low to high on the x-axis. So this is one of those little in-class participation activities where you get a chance to be like, yes, I was in class today. And I answered some questions. See if you can label for me A, B, C, D, E, F with the different biomes based upon what you know about temperature and precipitation in that biome.